Hello. All right. So, like I said before, these are gonna be short. I'm gonna run through some of the information as quickly as possible for chapters 11, and then again for chapter 12, so that you have the information. All right. In chapter 11, we're going to talk about the income expenditure model. Another word for income expenditure model is a budget. All right. So we're going to do a simple income expenditure model on a graph. We're going to show it as the consumption function. We're going to look at the equilibrium output and the consumption function together. And then how does government spending and taxation affect our budget? How does it affect exports and imports? And then we'll look at income expenditure model and the aggregate demand curve itself. All right, so basically, Keynesian cross is our income expenditure model. You have seen similar to this before. It's going to be labeled differently. So this graph is going to look, hey, I've seen that graph before to you. Except we're going to label it differently. We're going to label it expenditure and output. We're going to label the horizontal line, which used to be our demand line, as C plus I, because everything we spend, whatever's left is saved. That's what C plus I is. And then the vertical line, which looked like a supply line, stays the same. It just is going to look like the X is no longer up and down. It's going to look like it's tilted. All right, so the equilibrium is where A happens. And we typically see that as our GDP, where demand spent equals the supply provided. All right, so if firms produce too much, output's going to exceed expenditures and inventory is going to pile up. Basically, we've seen this before. If you recall, chapters 1 through 4, we saw shortages and surpluses. So this is the same thing. When it exceeds production, we have a surplus. When it's short, obviously, an insufficient production, we have a shortage. So these are signals that we actually need to do something, either with supply of labor or we need to increase wages. Something needs to happen. All right, so if we look at how we spend, that would be the C plus I, our spending plus savings. And let's set it all at 100, just what this chart says. But let's say production is at 80. If I'm trying to spend $100, or if I'm trying to, between savings and spending $100, that means that the depletion of the inventories of $20 is not there. Output needs to increase. All right? Needs to increase by that $20 or I'm going to be short. All right? Now, at $100 and $100, obviously there's no change. Everything stays constant and we're good. We like steady momentum. However, what happens when we overproduce at 120? That means we have an excess, and this is a typo on the 4, an excess of inventories of $20. I still need to sell that. Well, that means that I need to maybe not produce as much. All right, so these are key ideas of the expenditure model that firms take quick notice of to adjust how they're doing things. All right, if we also then notice how we consume, we then have to look at the consumption function. All right, that's C plus I, we're going to manipulate a little bit. We know that everything that we do that's not spent is obviously going to be saved. So we're going to put that off to the side and make it a 0. Remember, we like to hold things constant or fixed when we're manipulating other parts of the equation. And at this point, we're going to look at consumption function equals autonomous consumption. Those are everything that has to do with all of our constant bills, rent, utilities, food, things that we automatically spend our money on. not the excess, like, oh, I don't know, entertainment or trips or luxury items. All right, just the consistent things we spend our money on. And then the next part is B times Y. And that is our marginal propensity to consume. If we got a raise, we want to know, okay, so we're going to spend, say, 60% of it. There's a formula that we're going to mess with on B and adjust it on our GDP. So as a country is what we're talking about, not an individual. All right, and here is the consumption function. It looks like the supply line. Oh, wait, that's what it was. Expenditures versus output. So we're just going to mess with our supply line. We consume everything we demand, right? Well, if we take away the X, we are going to look at how that applies to our slope. We want to see how the slope and the line actually, is it going to be steep or is it going to be more flat? All right, before we would say, if we're looking at supply, if we did a negative shift to the left, it would be a negative decrease in our supply. And it was parallel to the line. Now, we're going to talk about how it, kind of like that tangent or cotangent or how all trig deals with in math. This is how we're going to manipulate our slope of our consumption function. So it's not going to be parallel because, you know, I could say, hey, I need you to only spend 60% and you're supposed to save 40, but not everybody does that. Okay? So an increase in the MPC from B to B prime increases the slope of the consumption in the right-hand side. We don't know what that is because that percentage is going to manipulate what most people spend their money on. All right, so changes in consumer wealth, the wealth effect, or confidence could cause the autonomous consumption to change just a little bit. It could be due to like changes in tax, the availability of retirement benefits, or even borrowing money could also change that marginal propensity. If I'm looking at spending only $8,000 on a car, I might want to borrow $10,000 to make sure that I meet my car payment every single month. That's a possibility. These are things that go into making those decisions to borrow money. Tax. Most of the time when we increase taxes, people don't spend their money. They save it for a rainy day. Having retirement benefits or not, what happens if we threaten that Social Security is going to go away? People get scared and so they don't spend. All right. So MPC is not identical typically to across the class system or economic system of our households. But it is very similar. What we used to think is, oh, the rich themselves, they have all this excess money. That's not the case. What their lifestyle does is, well, you and I may live in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment or house. They live in a 5 or 6 bedroom house that takes more money to heat, more money to clean, more money in mortgage, more money on the outside and inside the land. It's a bigger space to take care of. It costs more money. So typically about 30% of the wealthy people we look at are living paycheck to paycheck. All right. So let's move forward. So what's that equilibrium output of our consumption? Where does it meet? All right. If we look at C plus I, which is consumption plus savings, and we set it equal to our consumption function, we now can take the i's off and put them at 0, and we now have that equation, C equals CA plus BY. All right? We know that consumption is going to be our autonomous plus a little bit extra of our raises. All right, we use this, and you don't have to memorize this. You just need to see how it works. If we use it in the appendix to show the equilibrium Y as our output, then the autonomous consumption plus investment, C plus I over, or CA plus I over 1 minus MPC, which is also another way of saying MPS, right, is equal to Y. Then we do the multiplication, division, and adding and subtracting left and right of the equation so that we actually get C. We need C at this point in time. And we'll manipulate the equation to get there. All right, so basically, when we've readjusted so that we can solve for Y, we start working through the problem. We can plug in numbers and find out exactly what Y is. What is our total GDP? So if we have autonomous consumption of being of 100, we plug that in. We have investment of 40. C plus I gives us 140. And let's say we only want to spend 60% of that. Then typically, what are we looking for as being left over? What is going to be I when we're done and the manipulation of that? Well, 100 plus 40 divided by 1 minus MPC gives us 140 divided by our marginal propensity to save, and that's going to give us our total yield. Because we can't consume everything if we're saving everything. We have to do both. All right? And all this is going to do, most of the time what you're going to get on the test is I'm going to give you solutions or the actual numbers to plug in. You're going to have to do the math to find out what the variables amount to. All right? If we look at savings versus and investment, we then can invert or replace I with savings, like I've said before, if you're not consuming, you're saving. So I equals S. And then if we want to do the opposite of consumption, we want to save, we can then manipulate the equation so that we get a Y minus 100 plus BY. Or if we do the negative all the way through, we get Y equals negative 100 plus 0.4 Y. Because obviously Y minus Y or 0.6 Y gives us 0.4. So typically BY is marginal propensity to save times your GDP. That's what that means. So now we need to be able to say that this is our savings function instead of our consumption function. All right, another way to find the equilibrium in the model is to use the idea that equilibrium, savings equals investment, which we've already said, and we can actually plot that. All right, while we understand assuming that the investment spending is fixed, it actually fluctuates. Business cycles are business cycles. You and I change our ideas all the time. And so if we look at the equilibrium, what happens to it is that changes in investment spending can also affect our consumption. This is going to have a multiplier type effect, though. So if you take a rock and you throw it in a pond, if I spend money at Walmart, those Walmart employees get paid. They then go spend money somewhere, maybe even at Walmart, paying themselves, and it just keeps rippling out to however many spots we want to go to. All right, so we need to then look at the change in output is being greater than the change in investment. That would be a good thing. People would be spending more than they actually are saving. So the multiplier, change in Y over change in I, basically works out this. 1 divided by 1 minus MPS, or MPC, excuse me, ends up being 1 divided by MPS. That's actually what the multiplier is. All right, so if we look at another application, multipliers are good and bad things. So if we look at bad things, they can have a domino effect negatively. We can look at the Great Depression. That explains that. But they can also look at good times as well, 2009 to 2016 wasn't a bad thing because we had not that much inflation. That's not a bad thing. But are fiscal multipliers higher in a recession than they are during booms? That's the question. Typically, they might be during a recession. There's less concern about crowding out private investment because, well, it's tough to compete when you have no money. Recent evidence is mixed, though. One study stated that little evidence of changing multipliers, while another on a range of developing countries found multipliers as high as 2.3. So we may not have a change, but then we may have a great change. Depends on the economy itself. Or the multiplier. So, how can government fix things? How can government slow negatives and positives? Well, it has to do with how they spend. If we look at taxes and spending influencing the economy or GDP, then, and we're looking at the short run, we know that in the long run, they'll have an effect. Because government purchases and investment appear identical in the expenditure formula, their multiplier is typically the same. We have negatives, they're going to go up, but they're not going to go up on supply. It's going to have a negative impact. It's going to bring expenditures. When output is going up, people are spending more. When output is going down, people are spending less. Keep in mind, this is a tilted version of our original supply and demand. So think if supply is going to the left, decreasing, that means we're spending more money because the prices are high. If the supply itself is going to the right, that gives us a surplus. That means that prices are coming down, which means that we're spending less money. So if we are increasing government spending, that means that we're not having to buy as much because prices are too high for us to buy. We need government confidence by their spending habits to say that it's okay. Same thing. If it's going down in price, we need to also then get people to stop buying because it's overtaxing our systems. But regardless, notice that the left and right change. These are going to have different rules as opposed to what we had before with demand. Income increases, we spend more. Income decreases, we spend less. Watch how it does with the government spending multiplier. And before we get to that, we need to figure out taxes as well. When I'm saying taxes Y minus T, I'm talking about net taxes. Taxes that are paid, they're after the income tax. So I've made income taxes. Taxes have been collected. I don't want to overtax. So they're not necessarily what you and I pay. It's taxes paid to the government minus the transfers that are received by households. So it's, if I'm giving refunds back to the poor people, whatever's left over between all that IRS shifting of money, that's what we have left over for our budget. And if we use it, we have to take some of that, we have to take the tax off our GDP so that we know how much it needs to be spent. All right, so when net taxes are changed, the initial effect on expenditures only by BT. But that is if the multiplier times the marginal propensity to consume, times the tax change as if Y is not in the picture. So the tax multiplier then becomes, so when we're feeling, tax multiplier is going to be negative for us because if you notice Y minus T, so that's a negative marginal propensity to consume divided by our marginal propensity to save, or 1 minus MPC. So notice that it becomes negative. It's because when we take off the taxes, what's left over is basically what we're saving from our GDP. Does that make sense? I hope. Keep in mind you've just got, this is sometimes a little bit beyond, but it'll make sense. We don't deal with taxes that much, but what we do analyze is how does it affect our behavior? All right, because the multiplier of government spending is larger typically in an absolute value situation than the tax multiplier itself, an increase in government spending and an identical increase in taxes will actually increase the GDP. How much? That's the question. That's why we have a balanced budget multiplier. So how do we balance this? All right. It can be in 3 different situations. Suppose the marginal propensity to consume, what we're going to consume is about 60% or 0.6. Then if we plug everything in, 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6 ends up being, after all the addition and subtraction and division, 2.5. That's for additional government spending. Now the tax multiplier is again negative, but we're going to use, notice that 0.6 becomes a negative 0.6 over our marginal propensity to save, or 1 minus MPC, but we plug in the MPC so we can figure out marginal propensity to save. The subtraction from 1 ends up being 0.4, so minus 0.6 over 0.4 gives us a negative 1.5. But if you do an absolute value, notice that 1.5 is less than 2.5. It's a smaller situation. So now let's say we want to increase the economy, or increase our GDP by $60 billion. We could, 1, increase our government spending by $24 billion, which by doing the multiplier, we can then figure out that that's going to lead to an overall $60 billion increase after all the multiplications apply. That's one thing. Now, what if we don't do increase government spending and we decide to decrease taxes? All right, so let's decrease taxes by $40 billion. If we do the negative multiplier and multiply it by 40, the 2 negatives become a positive, and that will give us a $60 billion. But we've decreased taxes. We've put money into the people. They're spending the money. All right, let's increase spending and increase taxes. Wait, miss, but I thought you said that if $60 billion by decreasing that. If you increase spending, you got to increase taxing because you got to have the money to spend, right? That's the concept. If you don't have the money to spend, you're going to be broke and be in a deficit. We don't want that. So if you increase spending, you got to increase taxes. This is the third option, both by $60 billion. So that's 2.5 times 60 billion, which will give us 150. And then negative 1.5 times 60 billion, and that'll give us a negative 90. 150 minus 90 gives us $60 billion increase in our GDP. There are 3 options that government policy can do to get growth. Now, what's our lesson? Although this seems simple to me, seems probably complicated to you, the more you practice it, the better it becomes and the simpler it sounds. Our expenditure model illustrates some important information. Government spending will increase total expenditures. We know this. We know the GDP will increase if government spends money. Because we're spending money, private business is spending money, and if government increases their spending, that increases the GDP. All right? If we cut taxes, it will increase the after-tax income of our consumers, and then it will lead to an increase in planned expenditures. See, if I give money back to the people, we're expecting them to spend the money. Most likely, if I don't have to save for taxes, I'm going to spend money, probably on things I couldn't afford before. And then finally, policymakers need to take into account the multipliers for government spending and taxes when they develop policy. They can either increase spending, increase increase spending, decrease taxes, or government increases their spending and increases taxes at the same time. So what's the caveat? Well, any government project can boost a GDP. Just remember that it's not going to be perfect. We looked at FDR and the New Deal, and not everybody said that they got a good deal out of it. The second New Deal, same thing, but it did help the economy. Wise government spending on things that we actually need will benefit us in the long run. And it'll be better for us than wasteful spending on things that, well, we probably could use the money elsewhere. So an example, if I were to pay people to dig holes and then fill them right back up again, that's going to increase the GDP, but do they enjoy their job, or is it a wasteful job? Think on that. All right, if we look back over the growth rates of GDP, we notice that the World War II did end permanently the Great Depression for that period of time. But we also see that we have really sharp peaks and troughs. And as government policy expanded, taking into account the increased taxes and transfer payments and automatic stabilizers, we noticed that after 1950, there were less peaks that were spiky and troughs that were spiky. There were more like rolling hills. I mean, we still had some, but they weren't nearly as drastic. All right, increase in the tax rate. This is different than the net taxes, okay? It's like if you file your income tax, you look at your paycheck, you see a gross total amount that you made with making your hourly wage. But you also have those taxes that got taken off your paycheck. Where did those taxes go? We're going to adjust because we don't know. We don't want, until government spending starts to take place, we don't want to know. We need to know what, without any additional policy, what's going to actually happen to our GDP. So the tax rate is what we're going to use instead. So where is this T in the tax rate? It's very similar to what it was before. But instead of it being Y minus T, we take 1 minus T, multiply it by B and Y. So it ends up being consumption plus, and if you do all the multiplication, B minus TY. Because you want to take that off of your actual marginal propensity states. This is what we call an adjusted marginal propensity to consume. We got to take that off, what we normally would spend, and give us what our net spending habits are going to be. All right, and then this brings us to our last application. If your parents have ever let you play baseball outside, they always say, make sure you throw the ball and hit the ball away from the windows. The reason is they've already paid for those windows. And if you break it, well, that means you can't go to college because they got to use your college money to pay for the windows, to fix the windows, to pay the multiplier in fixing that window. So it's not, the money could have been used elsewhere. It's already been planned somewhere before you break the windows, basically what's being said. It's an opportunity cost. You can either break the window and not go to college, or you can go to college and not break the window. Your choice. But please don't break the window is what we're trying to tell you. The funds basically being spent could have been spent elsewhere. Typically, if we look at public spending for taxes, some fear it is wasteful, like repairing the broken window. The argument is strongest in the classical model. If an economy would be at full employment anyway, government spending simply gets rid of private investment or private spending. That's not necessarily true, but in the Keynesian model, some resources are underutilized. So the extra spending really can increase. Or all it does is add to what we have. And then the last topic we're going to have is exports and imports. If by chance their role is to determine the equilibrium income, then we need to look at exports are demanded by foreigners and are fixed, unaffected by our domestic economy. Imports are bought by domestic residents whereupon the funds leave the country and are not here. So their level depends on domestic income. So if it's marginal, we look at M, the little m, as being a marginal propensity to import, and the big M is a marginal propensity, basically, of our GDP is being imported. When we purchase imports, those funds then leave the economy and they never return. Or they would return at small amounts, depending on how we trade. The resulting fraction of the income, though, spent on domestic goods becomes B minus M. And it looks like the subtraction from taxes. Well, kind of is. You can take off net. You subtract our net from the GDP, right? Well, that's where this comes from. This becomes the slope and of planned expenditures, because if we're spending in China, we're not spending here. So an increase in exports has an identical effect to an increase in investment. We have to have an export multiplier. Oh wait, it's an adjusted off of our marginal propensity to consume. Looks very similar to the multipliers we've had before. 1 minus adjusted MPC, that B minus M. And this changes our propensity to import, pretty much similar to the marginal propensity to consume. Think about it this way. If we were a big car maker, Dodge, Ford, Chrysler, Chevrolet, Cadillac, we're a big car, Henry Ford, all over the place, right? And we've been making them up until 2001. 9/11 happens. Between 96, 92 and 2001, we actually grew 5% more than we typically have been doing. That's a big chunk. U.S. imports, though, helped fuel demand for the rest of the world's output, because somewhere somebody was making stuff because of NAFTA. This effect was then particularly strong for developing nations. As the economy faltered, though, because of 9/11, growth from other countries and China took up our slack. When we crashed a little bit, China and some of those Asian countries began to get the locomotive business. So that net imports shifted from exports to a negative amount. So how does this income expenditure model and the aggregate demand curve actually relate to each other? We have basically looked at a full planned expenditure model, and we are ready to see the relationship. Remember, we've been assuming that price level stays constant as we've developed everything, because we like to deal with constants. As the price level, though, falls from original price to the next level, our planned expenditures increase. We spend. This is due to wealth effect, interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. Get a new income. Interest rates fall. International trade, we're exporting left and right and forward. This increase, though, allows the level of output to shift from its original to the new level to the right. So remember, I told you we tilted that supply demand. This is why we tilted it. If we look at our typical price level output, our original demand line, we now see that the supply can affect that demand line. So a negative shift in supply on our economy, you got to think supply is now our economy. A negative is going to bring down those prices, because when people can't buy, it lowers prices. But the effect, though, is on demand. That price level shift allows us to then shift and do a seesaw method, balance out, and we then eventually start spending more. So this cause and effect is actually in place. We can also see how a change in a component of planned expenditure changes aggregate demand. In the graph, government is spending more, and this increases the output. The price level itself, though, didn't change, because our spending may have either decreased or stayed the same, but then we have government spending that took the place of what we would have spent. Now, instead of the demand shifting to the right, it's not actually changing. Hopefully, if you have any questions, you will contact me. Hopefully, this video helps you.